Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome to the Visiting Speaker Series. My name is Tamara Pesic. I'm very pleased that you could join us this afternoon for a talk by Robert Fuller. Dr. Fuller did his PhD in physics at Princeton University. He then taught physics at Columbia University. And if you did physics as an undergrad, you might have used his textbook, which has been very, very well read and is still used in many universities. After he was a professor, he then went and ran Oberlin College, which was also his alma mater for an undergraduate. And then at some point he changed his life a lot, and he went from being a professional geek to being a very, very thoughtful person. Not that geeks aren't thoughtful. I'm just going to have to rewind and backstep a lot. He's written two amazing books, I think, on how we treat each other and how we as a culture can move forward and treat each other with dignity. And I think this is very important. I think this might be the most important talk that the Visiting Speaker Series hosts this year. I think it's important for many reasons. The way we treat each other internally translates directly into how much our customers like us and how much money they give us. How we treat our customers externally translates in how much people love us and how much money they give us. All of this translates into stock price. So I know there's many ethical and moral arguments for treating each other well, and for creating a dignitarian society. However, if that doesn't interest you, I have lots of just purely money arguments that I could go on for. So I'll stop tripping over my own words, and please help me welcome Dr. Robert Fuller.
Thank you. I thought I'd say a few words about my passage from geekdom to, how did you put it?
Very, very thoughtful.
I don't know about that. But I brought my credential along as a geek. It's so long since I really could lay claim to the title that I wanted to show you the evidence that once I was a geek. And what was great about being one was I didn't have to persuade anyone of anything in this book. I just wrote the proof, put QED at the bottom, and walked away. Take it or leave it. What a relief that was, because I had a mother who made me prove everything and made me argue everything. And I had a father who was a geek. I followed in his footsteps. He worked at the greatest research lab in the world in the 40s and 50s, Bell Labs. And I grew up in the shadow of Bell Labs, where everyone was a geek, where the guy a few doors down whose lawn I mowed had a Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor. And my own dad came home one night with something that looked like a quarter or a 50-cent piece with two wires coming out of it, shined a flashlight on it, and the thing made a windmill turn. This was the photoelectric cell, the first one, the solar cell as we know it. And I thought that was pretty cool. But he could make things with his bare hands, and I was the opposite. I could only do mathematics and couldn't make anything work in the lab. So I took refuge in math from a very early age, where I didn't have to persuade anyone of anything, and didn't have to do any promotion, and didn't have to engage in political arguments. What a relief. I still yearn for that space. Very early on, in the shadow of Bell Labs, in my little hometown of Chatham, New Jersey, where no African Americans were allowed to set foot, it was all white kids, I noticed something that ended up being my life's work. It was in second grade, and the teacher began every day by inspecting the fingernails of the 25 pupils. And one day, Arlene was sent to the hall because she had dirty fingernails for the whole day. And we walked out past her to the ball field, to the soccer field, and she was slumped against the wall near the drinking fountain, and I wondered, how can she clean her fingernails out there? But it wasn't a moral thought or anything. It was just the observation of a kid witnessing something that stuck with me all my life. And there were a great many other examples of the same kind of treatment, because our class was divided into two groups. As I said, there was no one of color, so the division was different than it would have been in other towns. And it wasn't confusing as it would have been if there had been people of color. It was that some of us were the sons and daughters of PhDs, like me, and others were the sons and daughters of farmers, which was the other half of that town, like Arlene. Like Gerald, another one of my friends, who was as good, if not better, at arithmetic than I was. But Gerald lived on a chicken farm, and 50 years later, a few years ago at our class reunion, I saw him again, and of course wondered what had happened to him. Well, he spent a lot of time in jail. He never received the slightest bit of encouragement for his mathematical ability. And I think, moved by people like Arlene and Gerald and many others, I developed a question which was, crudely put, are dumb kids dumb? Actually dumb? Or is it something else? Because I felt I had been witness to their destruction. I couldn't have said any of this, of course, as a third grader or a seventh grader. It was only later that I came to see it that way. It was actually just across the lake in Seattle that I came to see it that way in 1967, when I was for 1 year at the Patel Research Science Center over there in Laurelhurst. And I finished this book, and its secret subtitle should be Farewell to Physics, because this was my last hurrah. And I went to Garfield High School, which was threatening to burn down the central area in 1967. The whole country was under threat of siege and violence and arson and fires in Watts and Detroit, and maybe, if we don't do anything about it, in the central area in Seattle. So I went down there, and others did too, and I offered to teach a class for kids who were supposedly so dumb that they'd been kicked out of every other class in the high school. You had to have flunked 4 classes to get into my class. And it wasn't hard to fill it with 20 young men, all black. And I had the feeling that if they could be made to feel secure, that their dignity was not under assault, that they might actually be able to learn, and learn as well as anyone else. That was the hypothesis. A year later, I think it was proven, but not in the way that the theorems in this book are proven. It was proven only in the sense that I could argue that when tested at the end of the year on what we'd covered, they did incredibly well. But the curriculum was unique. The curriculum was made up on the following premise: I will only teach you what you say you want to know in the next 5 seconds. So if you're bored, we stop, we switch. So I was like chasing a soccer ball around the field of knowledge. And of course, there were lots of things I didn't know and couldn't speak to. And then I would say, if you still care about this tomorrow, ask me again, because by then I'll know. And so the class began with questions about sex, naturally, and moved from there to questions of violence and what is death, and there had just been a heart transplant that year, and that was fascinating. We went wherever they said they wanted to go. And about 6 months in, I was asked the best question I have ever been asked in all my teaching life, better than by people who went on to win Nobel Prizes taking my course in general relativity at Columbia. The question was, well, I got to give the context. I had been saying something about how black skin has its advantages. You may not believe it, because they'd been telling me what a curse it was in Seattle in 1967, how they were picked on, how there was no justice, and so on. But I said, well, there's one advantage, and that is you don't catch skin cancer, like me. And some kid immediately said, okay, how come everyone isn't black? It's a good question, because it means he got the idea that there's survival value in being black, and if there is, everybody ought to be black. The whites ought to have all died off. I didn't know the answer. I bet you half of you don't know the answer. It's obvious in the aftermath of Guns, Germs, and Steel, more of us know the answer, which is that if you're not black, it's because your ancestors went north, where there was not much sunlight, and where you damn well better absorb all there was to make enough vitamin D not to catch rickets. So that's why some of us are light-skinned. It's only because we got to absorb all the ultraviolet there is out there, or we're in trouble. But we do catch skin cancer, but that price is worth paying because rickets is fatal much quicker. So I had the answer the next day, and sure enough, they still wanted to know. And it was good that I could show some racial pride, so to speak, that there was a survival value in not being dark, too. It just proved that my ancestors had been up in Scotland, is all it really proved. That course at Garfield made me eligible for a college presidency, because at the time there were only a handful of white guys in the country who'd ever even experienced work closely with African Americans, and that was the hot issue on campuses in the late 60s, early 70s. And also I had the other absolute requirement for being a college president. I was over 6 feet tall, which I sometimes think is the main condition. In fact, I went to a meeting of college presidents at which I was relatively short. I thought I'd stumbled into an NBA convention. Height was correlated with authority, and still is, but less so now than it was then. All these issues of authority, rank, status, the damage done to people who lack the protections of rank. You see, I mean, I didn't really have rank in second grade when Arlene was sent to the hall, and my fingernails were probably as dirty as hers. But the teacher didn't want to deal with my mother the next day, who was on the school board. So I had those invisible protections, which I was completely unaware of then, but subsequently became aware of, and was fascinated by this question of what would happen if we actually created a dignified learning environment. Would it enable everyone to learn much better? And I'm certain it would. I'm certain that just as African American children trying to learn in a completely racist environment would be at a terrible handicap, so too anybody in a completely rankist environment will be at a handicap, because they'll put most of their energy into defending their dignity. That's what school is all about, is defending your dignity, which is under constant assault from not so much teachers anymore. They learned somewhere between my second grade teacher and the teachers of today. There was a big revelation. And teachers began treating their students with dignity by and large. But fellow students do not. Fellow students rather imitate the rankist culture around them that is manifest on television and everywhere you look, and practice it on each other as part of the training for survival as adults, learning how to deal with mean girls or bully boys. The whole phenomenon of female bullying has come to light recently, and it's subtler, but it's every bit as demeaning and as challenging through the book Queen Bees and Wannabes and the film Mean Girls. It was at Oberlin that I began to see, after dealing in series with a bunch of aggrieved groups, each of whom had their ism that they were fighting, primarily African Americans, Asian Americans fighting racism, and women fighting sexism, and the beginnings of gays fighting homophobia. And also very much in play at Oberlin at that time was people with disabilities fighting ableism. And there are the other couple isms that we all know about, anti-Semitism, which was kind of crippled and on its way out by that point, that had been largely dealt with in the aftermath of World War II, and classism and ageism. So I began to see in all these 7 isms a common pattern. There was always a somebody group which had more power or social rank, and a nobody group which was the victim, could be victimized by people in the somebody group with impunity. Because of the power inherent in social rank, notwithstanding the fact that the social rank was a construct, was a creation, had no inherent legitimacy, but nonetheless functioned to keep people in the nobody categories fearful and exploitable. That's why we do it. We, Homo sapiens, are world-class predators. And we practice predation on other animals, and we're king of the hill in that domain, and then we practice our predatory techniques on each other. And I'm saying this without meaning to moralize right now, because it's very possible that the species never would have gotten where it is today if we hadn't been able to exploit certain groups on the way up over the last 50,000 years. It's possible. It's unknowable. I don't know whether we had to be predators against each other, but the fact is we have been. Up until very recently, it was just part of the game, part of nature's game, up until the 20th century probably. The predation was taken for granted, and if you could enslave another country and get them working for you, that was viewed as due to your superiority. Well, for reasons you all know, and I don't want to elaborate now, all that has come into question. And it begins to look almost as if the opposite is true, that where we can get rid of this predation, where we can enter into cooperative arrangements, we can outproduce people who are stuck in predatory patterns. If it weren't for the power of cooperation, all this would amount to is a pile of goody-goody moralizing. But it turns out that countries that actually enlist the loyalty of their citizens actually create a love of nation that goes beyond blood brotherhood, but consists of a sense of participatory citizenship. Those countries beat the attacks on them in the 20th century, which were primarily the fascist and communist attacks. We beat those back, and people who actually fought in the war will remark on the enormous resourcefulness of American and British soldiers when they lost their leadership. They didn't need a tyrannical leadership telling them what to do. They just jumped in and kind of did it in an almost magical cooperative way that outpowers the power that can be mobilized through command and control. When you can manage it. It isn't easy to manage in an organization or a country. It's somehow hard to put your finger on. So it's not as if we can afford to do away with hierarchies. We need hierarchies. We need the ranks that make them up. They still have a role to play because they're a tool of organization, an effective organization. But we have to distinguish ranks from abusive rank. They're so mixed up in most people's minds that a lot of people think the only way to get rid of the abuses of rank is to abolish rank itself. But if you do that, there'd be no difference between any of you and the head of this company. There'd be no difference between the surgeon in a hospital and the nurse, or the pilot in the plane and the stewardess, or the professor and the student. Ranks still serve a purpose. But so often is rank abused because it can get away with it that it's a big problem. And it needs a name, and I've coined the word rankism for it, because rankism is analogous to racism and sexism, which are respectively abuse and discrimination against people of color or gender, or female gender, and rankism is abuse and discrimination against people of lower rank by people of higher rank who can get away with it. Why can they get away with it? Because by definition there's more power in their rank. And so if the victim doesn't like what's happening and dares to protest, the victim can be lynched, fired, gotten rid of, made invisible, or just snubbed, or just demeaned, or scorned. Rankism runs the gamut from a raised eyebrow of dismissal all the way to genocide. Abuse of power inherent in rank, whether it be social rank or hierarchical rank. So it's a very broad definition. It includes the familiarisms. It goes beyond that to include the abuses that take places in families, schools, workplaces, healthcare facilities, churches, any organization where there's hierarchy. And as I said, it turns out that if you can get rid of the rankism in one of those organizations, it begins to sing. It begins to function way better because the people in it feel their dignity is secure. They don't fear belittlement. They don't fear banishment, a la Arlene. Imagine a girl like that having been banished, trying to learn the next day. You can see it's virtually impossible. She'd just be sitting there shaking, thinking this is going to happen again. And that is the state that most students find themselves in. Now, this is not meant to be a criticism, just an observation, because we're so everyone knows this, everyone has experienced it, but we kind of act as if it weren't the case. Just as, when I was a kid, we all acted as if racism didn't exist. It was just the nature of the world. I think as we give a name to rankism and become aware of it, you start seeing it everywhere. You see it, for example, right in the headlines. I'll give you a few examples. Katrina. It wasn't really a racist phenomenon. It was a rankist phenomenon because it was the weak, whether they be black or white, the poor, the elderly, the infirm, the sick. These were the people who got abandoned in the crisis of Katrina. And now, because there's a regional rankism in the United States, namely the North kind of looks down on the South, a legacy of the Civil War, it's quite possible that the damage done will never be handled properly. The whole failure to come to terms with it quickly would have been unimaginable if that had happened in Rhode Island or in Washington. You see rankism in the headlines. The other place you've seen it in the last few years is the Enron crisis, where people of high rank exploited their rank to set things up to make themselves incredibly rich. Generally, you see it in corporate executive salaries, where the senior brass pays itself not 10 times more than the janitor, but 500 times more on average in this country. The factor is only 10 in Europe and Japan, but it's 500 in America. And in some cases, it's 500,000 times more than the janitor. This is rankism, because this is self-dealing, this is self-aggrandizement, this is abusing rank by those who have it to aggrandize their own position rather than serve the interests of the company. You see rankism in the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, associated so much with Boston, but actually in California we know that sexual abuse isn't restricted to the Catholics. It's just as common in the Buddhists. It's a spiritual kind of rankism where you can pretend to greater wisdom, knowledge, and authority because you are the priest, the abbot, the monk, and then use that to intimidate and exploit weaker people in that religious order. You see rankism in Abu Ghraib, where the wardens abused their rank against the prisoners. Very often such abuse is sanctioned by people of even higher rank who then can deny that they had any knowledge of it or anything to do with it. Where there is an abusive state penal system, there is usually sanction for it from the governor's office. And where the opposite is true, in those few prisons where prisoners are treated with dignity, the recidivism rate drops dramatically. So it's in our interest, actually, not to fail to send people to prison who commit a crime. For sure, they can go there, though, in dignity. They're still serving the group by showing what happens to you if you kill or steal. So they're exemplifying this consequence for the rest of us. It's a role of some value in our transition to becoming animals that don't commit those kind of crimes, which I think we are doing, but very slowly. And in the meantime, the prisoners can be treated with complete dignity, just in our own self-interest, if we don't want them repeating the thing when they get out. So, to sum up, on the institutional level, this is a call for dignitarian organizations, ones which take as axiomatic the equal worth of everyone in the organization, not the equal talent, not the equal wages or salary, but the equal inherent worth, the equal dignity, the right to a place, the knowledge that there's a place for me. There's a place for us, in the words of that West Side Story song. That's what people want. They want to be secure in whatever rank they're in, and if the higher-ranking people will treat them with dignity, they will admire, even love the higher-ranking people. If the higher-ranking people subject them to indignity, they will become indignant, and sooner they will sabotage the organization, and later they will try and overthrow it, whether it's a small organization or a whole nation. If it's an organization or a business that becomes too infested with rankism, it will self-bankrupt itself because it is so terribly inefficient. I often start talks that I do in front of corporations by asking if anyone there is interested in making more money. Because if you are, you want to get rid of the rankism. It's really a block. There have been a few companies that purported to be dignitarian, famously Ben and Jerry's. Jerry I handed his diploma to at Oberlin. That was an accident. We only realized we were on the same wavelength 30 years later. Ben I've come to know, they sold the company though, and God knows whether it's still dignitarian. But it was, and it was a noble experiment. Other companies that are credited with this kind of spirit are Whole Foods and Costco. But I don't speak from personal experience about them. I just know that if a company like this was to make it an explicit goal that it would become dignitarian in its treatment of employees and its face to the world, there would be such a business advantage in that within years your competitors would be trying to catch up. And on the other hand, if other companies do it and anyone like Microsoft persists with an unexamined background of rankism, it will be an invisible handicap. But it's a tall order to undertake the disallowance of rankism in any organization. It's a long, slow process. We tried to disallow a very particular sort of rankism at Oberlin when I was there, namely the kind that goes by the name of sexism, in which men who enjoy a higher social rank according to a consensus that has since fallen apart, but at that time it was still barely holding together. The consensus that men were more important and so on was still intact when I got to Oberlin in 1970. The proof was that the single most famous faculty member at Oberlin, the only one that had a world reputation, just happened to be a female, one of 3 on the faculty. But it just so happened that this one person, who was the only one of them known abroad and known worldwide, was a woman. Her salary was 1/4 the salary of the highest paid man, which was typical because everybody said, well, women don't need it. And so I let them know that the faculty set the salaries at this college, by the way, and so I let the committee that set salaries know they had about 15 seconds to quadruple her salary or they were going to owe millions if she chose to do a lawsuit. Since then, equal pay for equal work has come a long way, but it's not quite completely handled in society as a whole, but it is within universities generally. It's still harder for women to get tenure-track positions, though. So, where do we go from here? Well, the next obvious stage would be a dignitarian society, not just a company, a family, a school, but a whole country. And what would that mean? That's a political agenda that I think can unify Americans from the broad, sensible middle of the political spectrum. Because its premise is that we as a society will ensure the dignity, equal dignity of everyone in the society. And that can be operationalized in terms of political principles and policies. It means, first off, surprisingly, that we acknowledge the wonderful anti-rankist tendencies built into free market capitalism. Free market capitalism sometimes gets a bad rap in countries that have it. Elsewhere they admire it because they know what a productive, miraculous engine of development it really is. But why is it so good? Because it knocks out companies that cheat, that indulge in rankism. It bankrupts them. The competition is a form of accountability, and accountability is the antithesis of rankism. So, without going into that more, I don't have time to make that whole argument now. One of the interesting consequences of a non-rankist society is that some of what the libertarians are saying is right, that the free market is amazingly productive and creative, and it has in fact been the engine of the American dream. It's why everybody wanted to come here. It's because in one generation you used to be able to work your way out of poverty in America. Now you can't do that anymore. And that is the most serious threat, I think, to our national character and existence. I think we are again in danger of splitting into two Americas. This time not one black, one white as in the 60s, but this time one rich, one poor. With a permanent underclass where almost nobody can actually live the American dream and escape from poverty in one generation. And if we settle for that, I think the American century is in the past. It will have been the 20th. But if we can figure out how to solve that problem, which every other society has too, we will resume our position as world leader. So that's the biggest thing that you have to address if you're going to build a dignitarian America. You have to figure a way to end the advent, the trend towards, and it's unmistakable, a permanent underclass. And what you would have to do that is 3 or 4 things. You'd have to realize that no one can live in dignity who doesn't have access to health care. No one can live, you can't call this a dignitarian country if you have to be rich to go to college. You can't call it a dignitarian economy or society unless the minimum wage is a living wage. Those big 3 things would be crucial. And they are traditionally more associated with progressives than conservatives. But where I've spoken about this in so-called red states, people seem willing to address those issues if a way can be found to do it that isn't full of waste and bureaucracy. And I think people who are concerned with that are right, that we have to find free market mechanisms that can deal with universal health care, access to quality higher education, and a living wage. And there are ways to do it. I mean, it's not my intention here to spell them out, but I know they exist, and there are experts who are waiting for a chance to introduce these policies. And finally, you may even need to do something really radical to break the stranglehold that the underclass finds itself in. You may have to do something like create an IRA in the name of every child that matures when the child is 18 or 25 or something. And there are plans that do this too, 3 or 4 different ones, all of them eminently affordable by this country. I mean, it's amazing how cheap they are. And the fact that we've done it before makes me think we can do it again. We did it with land-grant colleges. We did it with the GI Bill. We enfranchised whole groups that had not had access to higher education. We can do it again. We just need the political will, and for that we need a goal. And the goal I propose is to make this a dignitarian America, regain our leadership in the 21st century, and actually make ourselves beloved in the world again, which is a better protection against terrorism than all the military might in the world. Not that you disarm. You need to be very, very strong. But if you really want to pull the support out from under the 1,000 or 10,000 real terrorists in the world, and none of this would affect them one bit. Their program is independent of this. But we could deprive them of all the sympathizers by doing something that restored America's position, admired position in the world. And part of that is learning that one aspect of a good defense is not committing offense in the first place. We as a nation have been guilty of international rankism. So have other countries. It's not that we're unique in that respect, but we are the most powerful. Therefore, it's quite likely that we've indulged in some behaviors that the weaker people feel is rankist. We would need to listen. One of my friends set up shop on a park bench all over the world with a sign that said, "American willing to listen." Just that sign. And she sat there for months and took down notes, you know. Just the fact that there was one American willing to listen made a huge difference in the Soviet Union in the 80s. So I'm going to wrap up now and invite anybody to comment or ask any questions they have. And then after a bit of that, I'll be glad to hang around and talk to you as individuals or sign books if you're interested. Who has a question or a comment? Yeah.
I am kind of curious about the brought up earlier that I think that there's going to be this divide between America and a poor America. And if you look to the south, there's quite a few countries in Central and South America and even the lower part of North America that are kind of in that position. Mexico in particular, where 2% of the country controls 98% of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they recently had an election where somebody very leftist came really close and may still become president. And it looks a little further south to Venezuela,
Mm-hmm.
and you had more or less the same situation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got Hugo Chavez.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm kind of wondering, when you talk to audiences that are more on the rich end of the spectrum, when you're in the middle class and lower class, is there a recognition you don't wake up and equalize things, so at least you can see that you've got a chance if you're at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum? You either do that and fix the situation to equalize it, or you end up with another Hugo Chavez or worse.
Well, are you? I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Are you? What's the essential question in that? You described a lot of things, that seem correct to me.
The audiences that you speak to who are on the upper end, the rich end.
Yeah.
It would seem to me that if you want to keep what you have, it would be awfully smart.
Yeah.
To not put yourself in a position where you're the 2% that controls 98%, because there's a lot more of the other.
Okay, the nobodies outnumber the somebody.
The nobodies outnumber the somebody.
But they're
lopsided things. Usually it ends in a leftist revolution.
Yeah, but at that level, saying anything at just that descriptive level, it won't change the equation. The somebodies will still figure they can get away with it, and will not take action until, just like white America would not budge off its segregation until there was such a threat in the streets coming from below that they felt they need to see a visible threat. And this has not been really visible in either Mexico or Venezuela. I mean, there's unrest, there's unhappiness and dissatisfaction, but it's not enough of a threat to scare them into the kind of historic compromise and settlement that LBJ and MLK made in 1965 to bring America together again as one country, really to save it from bifurcating. And I don't think they're ripe enough yet for that. I don't think this United States is either. But the issue is rising in prominence. I mean, one presidential candidate coined the "To America" theme in the last election and wrote it into a vice presidential nomination. It got some resonance. But people aren't scared enough yet because the nobodies aren't organized well enough yet. So to make a movement, you always need the two things. You need to know what you're for, and you need to know what you're against, and you need to have a real palpable threat from the people who are against what they're against. And all those conditions were met in the civil rights movement and the women's movement, and now they are rapidly being met in the gay liberation movement. And I see the day when they will be met in the dignitarian movement or the dignity movement, but first it has to get very adept at identifying rankism, and you start in your circle of friends. And you build just like the women's movement did. It started with consciousness raising in living rooms, talking about their brothers, fathers, lovers, husbands. Then it moves from there into the schools, talking about how Oberlin was a sexist school, was what I was hearing. And you create a committee on the status of women and let them talk for a year and list the 23 things that bug them about the school. Then you take it into companies like this one. You have hearings in which people who are invisible are invited to speak. You make many processes more transparent. The 10 things you can do to overcome rankism in an institution are chapter 5 of the book here. And, there's 20 things you can do, too, but I just listed 10, and they're a start. And mainly you have to listen to everybody and get them to say the ways in which being part of this group makes me feel like a nobody. That reminds me, a school teacher in San Jose wrote a book called I Feel Like a Nobody When. And she did it by giving that sentence to all her third graders, and they completed the sentence. I feel like a nobody when I'm not invited to the birthday party, or when my parents are fighting, or when when I make a mistake in front of the class. And then the second half of the title was I feel like a somebody when my parents listen to me, when I get a new pair of ballet shoes. They completed these, and the teacher wrapped it all up as a book with illustrations. And it turned out that the kids just becoming aware of each other's feelings was half the battle. And bringing it out in the open like that was half the battle. So you go through a consciousness-raising period, and then finally the establishment, the power holders, they still won't budge. Absolutely not. They've got the power. They're going to hold it. It's full of perks. Then it takes organization and timing and practice. And if people care enough, they do this. And the first country where this happens will probably lead the 21st century, because the efficiencies of getting to that place of respect and dignity and cooperation that it facilitates allows you to dominate. So I think it will happen. I hope it happens in America. I think we have one more, we have it in us to overcome one last ism. We've done rather well, actually, in confronting the other 6 or 7 isms I've mentioned. I mean, you can look around and say, oh, look at all this residual racism and sexism and everything else. But if you look at the rest of the world, we're not so bad. And I think a lot of the residual racism and sexism and homophobia and other isms that remain are actually better understood as rankism. And when confronted in those terms, people can change. Because you see, if you ask blacks in a company what their biggest problem is, they'll often say things like, it's not racism anymore. The whites are fairly circumspect around me. They may be racist in their heads, but they don't express it because they know it's a career ender. And women will say the same thing, that their biggest problem often isn't overt sexism from men, that is no longer cool, but that they do get bullying from other women. And blacks will say that they get what I call rankism from other blacks. And it isn't named then, it can't be seen as racism or sexism, so you can get away with it. So there's a lot of residual stuff that will be swept up if we begin speaking openly about rankism. Yeah.
First, I'd like to thank you for visiting us this afternoon. It's really a wonderful talk. My question pertains to the similarities between your position and that classic thesis that John Rawls made about how we should approach society as the space in which you wear this veil of ignorance.
Uh-huh.
Cast aside a sense of what the particular affiliations might be with a gender or a socioeconomic status or whatever, and we formulate a set of rules that allow people to really kind of collaborate together. But the interesting part about that thesis in this book, who's now navigating
The Theory of Justice by John Rawls he's talking about. Yeah.
He says that we aren't composed of just these sort of arbitrary things, really. We have this innate word. It's almost a religious statement that says that the individual is profoundly important because of being an individual, because of being a human. And so to me, the question I'm posing is, do you view sort of that discipline in trying to explore what it means to truly feel important outside of your affiliation? Do you view that as an important part of the adding practice? Because I think that's an important part of this whole liberal sort of viewpoint, that you stop seeing people with a certain gender, a certain race, or a certain caste. Instead you view them as very important autonomous units, almost in a spiritual sense. So is that correspondingly something that you would present as a sort of a component of that message?
The Rawls type analysis, you mean?
No, the Rawlsian philosophical view that people
Yeah.
are innately important, that people are innately
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's where it's coming from. But, see, by itself, that can turn into nothing but empty moralizing. It has to be linked to identity politics. The difference is the identities I'm talking about now are human identities, not ethnic identities or gender identities. They're human identities upon which we wish to confer equal dignity. So this is a way of reframing the moral questions so they take on some of the urgency and some of the moral imperative that comes when you have an organization, when the indignities become translated into indignation, and that begins to confront the power holders. So Rawls's thing was fine, but I saw no placards in the street with his ideas on them. And you're going to see placards in the street that say "End Rankism." You see, there are bumper stickers all over the place now that have that on it. And we have a new one coming called "Dignity for" with the numeral all. Dignity for all. That's the slogan of the presidential campaign of someone who I think could ride this into the White House in 2012, if not 8. Probably not 8. Probably 12. By which time I think it'll be absolutely urgent. Right now, the toxicity, the uselessness of political dialogue is beginning to become apparent to everybody. There is just no middle ground between the left progressive position and the right conservative position. This model of a dignitarian society pulls from both traditions and puts them together in a new way. And I've been in 26 states and talked even in Wyoming and Idaho and Tennessee and places like that where they're not predisposed to like this approach. But when they see that in exchange for granting dignity to others, they will get their own dignity assured, they're much more open to it. Those people in those red states are voting as they do largely out of spite because they feel elitists on the coast are looking down on them and are condescending to them and are basically think they're a bunch of idiots. And it's not too far from the truth. And some of our progressive candidates actually openly manifest condescension by heaving sighs in the debates and things like that, and by acting superior to everybody. And this is such anathema in the red states that they'll vote against these candidates, even if it hurts their own economic interests. It would be easy to give up, yes. Could you stand up or speak loudly? Yeah.
I can speak loudly.
Good.
A lot of issues that come up when trying to address acting against isms is that our society is, for so long, has required people just to conform. It's been very Anglo-Saxon, the melting pot. Everyone becomes one.
Right.
Anglo-Saxon. And lately there's been a lot of movement to become the fruit salad, as you call it, where everyone has their own individual identity, but they're also distinct, and no identity is recognized as superior to the other. However, it seems that this conflicts with the traditional ideas of what is successful and what is expected of successful people, especially in manner in business, how you should behave, how you should talk. These things seem almost inherently rankist. So how do you propose that we handle those issues?
Vive la différence is how we handle them. The multicultural solution is the only answer, and it's wonderful. We actually love all these differences and our different hair colors, our different skin colors, our different eye colors, our different accents, our different dances. I mean, we love and celebrate and rejoice in all this stuff. And it's just I mean, you know people who don't. I admit there are people who don't, who want everybody to be like my grandmother was. But we're tipping over now into the place where we can celebrate, where it is America's obvious strength. We are the one country comes closest to being a microcosm of the world. And that decision was basically made in 1964-5 between LBJ and MLK. When they made that historic decision that we were going to be one America, then 3 generations later we will be, and we'll celebrate those differences completely. Meanwhile, it's very good to talk about them all, and even to heighten our aware of the differentiation, but in a context of equal dignity for everybody. I mean, because we're in that transitional phase now where we're kind of weaning ourselves from that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American original thing, and we're weaning ourselves from it very, very quickly. It was totally intact when I was a kid. It was synonymous with Wonder Bread. It was, you know, it was just what everybody thought everybody should be to be perfect. And now it's out the window. Yeah.
How do you tell a dignitarian to increase profits, especially when many companies can say they're successful without it?
Without dignity?
Yeah.
Well,
As you described.
yeah. That's a tough one. It's a short-run, long-run issue. I mean, Walmart's a classic example of a company where they don't seem to lean over backwards to concern themselves with the dignity of every employee. And insofar as they do, it's a bit of a false promise, a lot of hoopla, you know. And they seem to have prospered nonetheless. And there are other, in the short run, you can definitely prosper. The South prospered on slavery for a while. You can get away with it for so long, but gradually the nobodies begin to get more and more restive, and they finally team up and overthrow the system. And you see signs of that, incipient signs of that, even at Walmart now. But I don't know really enough to go into it in depth. I have a feeling that for a company like this one, there is a tremendous opportunity were you, for example, to formally pursue the ideal of becoming a dignitarian company. It's an opportunity that could translate into the bottom line very quickly. And that I think, for one thing, one element of elitism or rankism is kind of handled up front in a company like this, because young people cannot be systematically put down, because it's a research company at bottom, and research is so dependent on the success of young people. So it can't have the usual kind of seniority thing in any strict way, because the creative contribution is coming from people who tend to be young, just like mathematicians are usually young. So that is kind of a jolt to business as usual, rankist business as usual. But then all the other old forms can creep right back in. But at least you have your foot in the door. You have a head start, because there's one way in which you're not rankist. There is respect for a 23-year-old who can write brilliant code here. Yeah.
Just tying a couple of the last two points together, I think the high-tech space is in general pretty unusual in that there's a lot of tolerance of different modes of attire, certain kinds of attire.
Exhibit A.
I run into Balmer when I'm wearing stuff like this. It's just, but doesn't judge me for that. And I think things are even more acutely like that in the Valley. I pitched to VCs wearing stuff like this and gotten funding. So I think at the societal level, using the engines of wealth and the engines of power in this and other allied bases, I think that's a way to sort of spur this on. In terms of JC's question, I think the way you show this is you get a few initial proof points of things that are dignitarian and or relate to these dignitarian principles and show huge value. And I can put in a shameless pitch here. If you look at //msblog/ad astra, this is the I'm leading the project to come up with game-changing strategies to compete with Google, and I've intentionally said and told everybody, we're doing this in a broad-based way to hear the voices that aren't getting heard, not just the rankist people in Redmond. We've got some weird definitions of rank here as well as all the standard ones, so not just the technologists, not just, we know all of these dimensions, and I'm explicitly trying to show that out of this process in a relatively short period of time, we can solve some really crucial business problems for the company and use that as a proof point to build other successes on it. So that would be my take on.
Also,
Well,
You repeat?
she's wondering if I've gotten the message through to any politicians. I don't know. I know this. Elizabeth Edwards is reading this book, and there are whispers that she exerts an enormous influence on John. And Gore was handed a copy of the book the other day by a friend of mine who said, and I quote, "You won't be interested in this book unless you're thinking of running for president." And he took it. Well, that doesn't prove anything. I don't think I have gotten through to candidates yet. Dean has the book too. Nobody reads anymore. You can't get through. If any one of those three guys had been a fly on the wall in town hall across the lake 1 week ago, where there were 200 people, and it was not a well-lit room, it was a dark room. It was perfect for giving essentially a campaign stump speech, and I gave one, as if, you know. I think they would have said, I could steal some of that rhetoric. That will fly. That will fly in Tennessee and maybe even in Idaho. And it does fly there. I've tried it. It flies there. Someone is going to pick this up. If the wrong side picks it up, they'll Orwellianize it, neuter it, and nothing will happen whatsoever, and they'll be absolutely have a lock-on office for 20 years. So there's a lot at stake. Let me walk to the other side. Yeah.
So I want to talk about this rankism on two different levels. For example, international level, where we talking about rankism among different countries, and let's talk about rankism in the domestic society in the U.S. So the United States is a very powerful country. My question is the following: how does this image of dominance and actions such as war against Iraq will affect the formation of a dignitarian society inside the United States, where you have people of different race, nationality, religion, etc., etc.?
I don't quite know what you're getting. Can you turn your question into a statement? What do you think? I'm not shying away from answering it, but I want to see if there's a statement under the question.
So how does the dominant image of the United States
Yeah.
against different countries in the world, for example, Iraq, Arabs, affects formation of a dignitarian society in the U.S., where you have people
Okay.
from different countries?
Yeah, okay. It's a complex question. Yeah. I think when Americans see our nation exerting dominance over some piece of the world, that the people within the country who are sympathetic to that piece of the world are really turned off by it and regard it as an attack almost on them because it's on their brothers. So that's a second level problem, though, I think, to how the rest of the world sees America as a dominant power engaging in force somewhere in the world. Now, you have to word this very carefully, because there are times when using force can be exactly the right thing to do and be almost a responsibility of holding high rank. Just to make it really real for you, 20 years ago, we couldn't even use domestic force against, we couldn't use the police department against domestic abuse in this country. A man's home was his castle. He could beat up his children and his wife in it and get away with it. 15 years ago, he could even murder his wife and get away with it. Now, the SWAT team comes in real quickly and handcuffs him and takes him off to prison on the grounds that probably there is domestic abuse. And then later it's figured out if there really was. But we don't wait until it's too late like we used to. Similarly, George Bush the First, seeing a famine in Somalia with 5,000 people dying every day and 500,000 dead already, sent the Marines into Mogadishu and ended the famine in a week. Bill Clinton, in contrast, dilly-dallied for years, for months, about Rwanda and never did anything, and later said explicitly it was the biggest mistake of his presidency not to have used American force. So it's not the case that we should always not use force. But when we use force, it's got to be with a consensus behind us. It's got to be multilateral. All these things we've learned partly as a result of Iraq. which to way more people looked like a good idea 3 years ago than it does today. If anything, it has sobered us up tremendously on the wise uses of force. But I just don't want to go so far as to think that we should never use force any more than we would pull back all those police departments in the U.S. from stopping domestic abuse. Yeah.
On moral grounds, I should say, I very much agree with you, and I'm completely along. I'm trying to work out whether your argument holds when you make this statement that it's also economically best.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Ben & Jerry's, as you point out, was bought. By the basic free market principles, I realize it's an imperfect free market, I realize all that sort of thing. If that really was a strong competitive advantage, you'd think they'd stick with the same sort of dignitarian politics they did. And in fact, as you pointed out, you're not sure whether they did. I happen to know they actually lost at least the financial constraint that was capping the top salary to the bottom salary.
I think I heard that too.
The other comment on a related note is you were talking about organizational dignitarianism, and we're talking about, well, maybe we can manage dignity. You worked very hard to separate that from finance. A number of organizational psychology studies they've gone into have pointed out that you can do all sorts of wonderful things with titles, with empowering, with voicing, all sorts of things. None of those have any effect on worker morale and people feeling like they're a serious part of the organization compared to a 1 or 2% raise. People a couple extra bucks is really a strong incentive.
That's part of it.
The strongest thing that
a living wage.
Right. A living wage and a better wage than they had last year.
Yeah.
One of the strongest things that Ben & Jerry's was doing was capping that CEO salary at, whatever it was, 70 times the lowest paid worker. A very strong statement for a company like Microsoft, where a CEO very famously makes a little bit more than 70 times the lowest paid worker.
It was 7 at Ben & Jerry's.
7? Okay.
7. They only got paid $140,000, and the janitor got 20.
Again, that's a strong statement to make for virtually any established organization today.
Yeah.
It seems like it would be very hard to make on a competitive argument.
I agree. I don't think that's realistic. But we can start with the indignities. It's very hard to define dignity, but you can define indignity, and you know that when the CEO is getting 500,000 times the janitor, or even 1,000 times, that probably something's wrong. Probably there's self-dealing there. Probably it's not a good business practice even, because it's very hard to convince yourself that these CEOs with these exorbitant salaries actually are that much more competent than someone you could get for half that. I mean, it's very hard to convince yourself. It looks much more like favors granted to each other in the boardroom than it looks like a true measure of excellence. Anyway, the main point here is let's bring all that up for discussion rather than sweeping it all under the rug and have it all done in the back rooms. And that alone is that transparency element cleans out a lot of problems. Yeah.
How do you propose to recast the gay rights debate in a dignitarian framework when so many are approaching it from a deeply held religious ideology standpoint? And I mean, how do you recast that?
Well, I tried this in Idaho, where they're not that friendly to gays. And if you start by plunging people into what they feel like when they are nobodied, and they recall how that feels, it can sensitize them to how a gay person feels when he or she is nobodied. So that creates maybe an opening. Then you can mention that religion is the great dignifier of human beings. In its essential teachings, all the great religions really speak explicitly about the equal dignity of everyone in the religion. And they don't practice it, of course, because they have their priest classes who proceed to lord it over the other people, but they do preach to the other people that they are all of equal dignity. And if they're all of equal dignity, and they're all God's children, and the sun is shining equally on everybody, it follows, like a mathematical theorem, that these people of different colors, of disabilities, even people who are completely handicapped through a small brain or something, microencephalus, whatever they are called, people who really can't function as people, even they have to be treated with equal dignity. Even an old person dying of Alzheimer's has to be treated with equal dignity. And of course, a gay person has to be treated with equal dignity. And I think the Idahoans I talked to, there were about 1,000 of them at a big conference. I couldn't do a poll, but I got the feeling by the end of the thing that they were open to this and that they were going to keep checking back to see if they would get any dignity in this picture or if they were just going to be dismissed as a bunch of hicks. But if they were sure they were going to be treated with dignity, I think they would open to this. And I think it could happen fairly rapidly in America. But right now we're so polarized and so mired in a sense of superiority and elitism and so on. And a lot of the pundits on both the sides of the aisle are feeding this and exacerbating it. I think we're not that far from seeing through what they're doing and firing a lot of them. One more question right there.
It's interesting you just talked about religion, because as this has been going on, I've been thinking about a speaker who talked about religion and how religions are founded on ideals of a founder who's in service to his followers.
Mm-hmm.
And that over time, the ideals get polluted in his terminology. And what I see is that really successful organizations, the people who have rank, treat their rank as a service position, not a power position.
Exactly.
And when they get going and they get rolling and people are willing to follow that, and then the organization gains power, and sooner or later those leaders have to be replaced, they tend to be replaced by people who are seeking the power of the rank, not to serve the community
right.
of the organization. How do you see that? I don't know. Is there a way to break out of that organizational cycle of you know, building on good ideals of someone who's in service to his community, and then creating in effect a power structure that gets, you know, corrupted and misused by the follow-on leadership?
This is a great question to end on. This sums up the whole of what I'm saying, that we haven't had on our checklist of what we want from leaders the disallowance of rankism. If you add that to the checklist, it will tend to hold successor leaderships in service, as has often been the case with founding fathers like George Washington, the quintessentially anti-rankist leader. Fantastic leader in that men loved him because he fought with them before he was president, and once he said, "Call me Mr. President, I will only serve 2 terms to make the point." And then some of his successors, every now and then we got lucky and we had someone who we felt was really in service to the country. But more often than not, what you describe happens. To make it not happen so often, I think we need the word rankist in the vocabulary so people can be pegged as that. Imagine we had a president right now who prided himself on his racism, or who was openly guilty of engaging in it. He'd last about a nanosecond. But rankism is still under the radar. Pull it above the radar and things will change. But for that you need to know 2 things. You need to know what you're for, dignity, but that isn't enough. That's just goody-goodyism by itself. What you're against is rankism, which is the source of indignity. Together, I think we could begin to hold leaders of countries and organizations and their successors to a higher standard. Thank you.